Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Manna April webinar. My name is Jasleen, and I'm an academic at Federation University, Australia, and I'm an ECR at Manna Institute, and I will be moderating today's session. Before we start, I would like to do an acknowledgement to the country. Manna Institute respectfully acknowledges the First Nations people as the continuing custodians of this continent and pays respect to elders past, present, and emerging. The Institute honors their rich cultural heritage, beliefs, and enduring relationship to the lands and communities in which we all live, learn, and work. Today, I come to you from the Wurundjeri country, and please feel free to mention where you are joining us today in the chat. For those of you who are joining us for the first time today, I would like to give you just a brief history of what Manna Institute is. So Manna Institute is a virtual institute which is formed by Regional University Network, also known as RUN. RUN is made up of 7 universities, which are University of New England, which is our foundation member or foundation university, Federation University Australia, CQU, Charles Sturt University, Southern Cross University, University of Sunshine Coast, and University of Southern Queensland. Our foundation partners are EveryMind, Lifeline Direct, Lifeline Research Foundation, and the Centre for Mental Health Research at ANU. At Manna Institute, we have some of the leading researchers and industry partners who are working with the rural, regional, and remote Australian communities to improve their mental health and well-being. Manna supports meaningful research, fosters the development of professional workforces, and translates research findings into practical, place-based programs. Now, today's webinar is going to follow the pattern of a previous webinar. That is, it's going to be a conversation style. It is a conversation between an established academic and an emerging academic on a topic which should be on all of our minds, which is the impact of environment and climate change on mental health. Today, joining us in this conversation is Associate Professor Fiona Charlson from Queensland Centre for Mental Health Research and our very own Manna HDR student, Kate McCubbery from Southern Cross University. Associate Professor Fiona Charlson is a well-respected and experienced psychiatric epidemiologist and mental health service researcher who has dedicated her career to addressing challenging global mental health research questions. She founded and leads the world's first mental health and climate change transdisciplinary research network and is at the forefront of efforts to understand and address the mental health impact of climate change. Fiona is a senior researcher with Manna Institute. Kate McCubbery is our Manna HDR student who has recently started her PhD journey with us under the supervision of Dr. Eric Breimer. Kate, would you like to give us the honor and tell us a little bit about yourself and your project before we start today's chat?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jasleen. I apologise in advance. I'm a little bit croaky. I'm on the end of a preschool plague that my daughter brought home, but hopefully I will be legible for the whole interview. So yeah, as Jasleen said, I came on board in January and I'm very grateful to be on Manna Scholarship for my PhD. So my PhD is still taking shape, but I am generally looking at ecological distress and its impact on mental health in rural communities. So I guess just to explain that a little bit more, when I say ecological distress, what I mean is the negative emotional responses to changes in the natural environment. So specifically, I am interested in how our relationship with or our attachment to the natural environment shapes our emotional responses to environmental change, and then whether those emotional responses impact mental health and well-being. So obviously, one of the main drivers of environmental change at the moment is climate change, and rural communities are frequently identified as being highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And on another level, these communities are thought of as having strong connections to their natural environment and the landscape. But relying on natural resources for your income, as many people do in these communities, can complicate that relationship a bit as well. So I'm hoping that my research will provide us with a better understanding of how our relationships with the natural environment shape our emotional responses to environmental change, which are obviously occurring at an increasingly frequent rate, and then how we can foster those relationships to reduce mental health impacts of environmental change in rural communities. And that's me.
Thank you, Kate. And before I invite Kate and Fiona to the center stage, I would just like to let you guys know that you're more than welcome to pop in the chat any questions you may have, or you'll feel free to ask them towards the end. We'll stop recording, so feel free after the recording has stopped to ask any questions at the end. But if you feel like you're going to forget it, or you just want to keep in mind that you have a question, feel free to pop them in the chat as well. All right, Fiona and Kate, the stage is yours.
All right. Well, I guess my first question, Fiona, well, first of all, just thanks so much for joining us. And I feel very privileged to have this opportunity to chat with you so early in my research journey. But I thought both for my benefit and everyone else listening, can you start by giving us, I guess, a brief summary of the research you've been doing in this climate and environmental change field in the recent years?
Yeah, thanks, Kate, and thanks to Manna for having me here today. It's really nice to have a chat with everyone. So I guess, so I'm involved in a number of projects, but I guess just to sort of give the big picture, I've been working as a public mental health researcher for about 16 years, and about 5 or 6 years ago, through my own sort of climate activism and action on climate change, and I guess almost a personal interest, I became sort of acutely aware of the emerging links between mental health and climate change. I was at a period in my career where I was finishing up a research fellowship, and I was sort of looking for a new program of research that I could chart and undertake for the next however many years. And it just became a natural transition and evolution to move into the intersection between mental health and climate change. And it really just started with me doing a scoping review. What do we know? What don't we know? The answer is we don't know a lot. The links there are pretty well established, not comprehensively, but we know that this is creating quite a mental health burden. But we don't know what the sort of solutions are yet, whether that's co-benefits, adaptation, policy, not really much done in the policy space. So there's a big volume of work that needs to be done. I thought, right, I trained as an epidemiologist, so I was very much in a silo, small team, didn't really interact with researchers, didn't have to interact to get my research done with researchers from other disciplines. But in a previous life, I actually came to research quite late. That was what I did. I collaborated and worked with people across various disciplines. So I realised, okay, this is a time to go back to those sort of ways of doing things. And I mapped who was working at UQ at the time, who was working in the sort of at the intersection of mental health and climate change, and pulled them all together. And that became the first transdisciplinary research network, which has grown a lot since then. And it's not just UQ, it's nationwide. So within that, there's quite a few research projects. The one that I've been specifically involved in are some systems modelling, so looking at the whole system in a particular community west of Brisbane, where I'm located, and looking at, and it's a rural community, and looking at within the whole of the community, what are these complex pathways linking climate-driven events or climate change and the events that they're causing to, well, not even just poor mental health, it could be like, how is it impacting mental health? That project we've just about to start the second phase of. So that's been really interesting, a really novel way to, but a critical way of looking and thinking about this as a complex problem. There's also been a project that we just wrapped up called Connecting Climate Minds, which was a Wellcome Trust funded project. I don't know if anyone's heard about this. There's a bit of social media and stuff around it, but that project has importantly developed for the Oceania region, so Australia, but also the Pacific and New Zealand, regional research and action agenda. So it tells us what from the community of practice, which includes researchers, practitioners and policymakers, what are the questions in mental health and climate change space that we have that need answering, and then how we're going to get that research done. So I see the link there. That project has just wound up, and that regional research and action agenda is available, and you'll hopefully see a bit more come out about that. So they're just two research projects, but we're also doing some policy work with the various policymakers, but particularly the federal government is quite active in the health and climate change space at the moment. So we've been doing some policy reviews and writing policy recommendations. Yeah, I'll stop there.
It all sounds super exciting.
It is. It's very exciting. When I started 5-6 years ago, it was snail's pace. It was just such an uphill. And now I feel like, you know, we're as researchers able to surf the wave a little bit because there is that momentum building. So it is exciting.
Yeah. It's funny. I actually did my honours at UQ in 2009 under Dr. Kelly Fielding, and I looked at motivating support for emissions trading schemes in my honours project back then, and yeah, I finished that project and kind of thought like, oh, of course this stuff's going to go through and everything will be fine. And I was like, I might go and I'll go down the kind of clinical pathway for a while now, and so I've kind of come a full circle as well, I guess, you know, after a bit of a clinical career to come back to this kind of research. But yeah, it's interesting how, you know, as a 21-year-old or whatever I was back then, I thought everything
yeah, well, it makes sense to us, right? But not necessarily. So many competing interests. Yes. Yeah.
So I guess just following on from that, in terms of bringing in the relevance for rural, regional, remote communities. So have there been any kind of key findings in the work you've been doing so far that you feel like are particularly relevant to those of us living and working in these communities?
Look, I'm not going to say there's anything startling, but it'll be things that don't sound that surprising. There's huge research gaps. So, you know, there's a whole lot that we don't know, but and that needs to be researched. But I guess of the research, and something I'll say actually is that scoping review that I did with some colleagues back around 2020. The Australian researchers have done a lot more than any other country in this space. So we're actually doing pretty well. And I think that's because of the research culture that we have here, but also because we're on the front line of climate change. So we're a high-income country, but we are really, we've been feeling it for quite a long time. So, yeah, we are sort of punching above our weight in terms of research, and quite a bit of that has been done in rural areas. I wouldn't say remote areas that I can think of offhand, but there's been some good research. So we know, and also not just on mental health, but a related issue of suicide as well. So there's been, we know that things like heat, which has kind of been studied predominantly in the literature, and I think that's because it's easier to measure and then link with hospital data, for example. So we have pretty good research showing elevated suicide rates associated with heat. and also psychiatric-related hospital admissions across all psychiatric disorders. So they're starting to become a bit through. There's quite a bit of research in relation to farmers and drought. And even before we sort of really started talking about climate change, that was the farmers and drought was a population of interest, but that's sort of increased since climate change. So it's more around particular issues that have been looked at and positive findings in particular groups rather than any kind of astounding, surprising bits of information. But I think that's just reflective of the state of the field. It's very much an emerging field. What we need is to really get into these populations and understand how climate change is impacting them. It feels a little bit anecdotal at the moment. Yeah, and you know, sort of perhaps in that system thinking approach that I was referring to before, because they're not just experiencing the same, you know, extreme weather events or environmental risk factors as they were before. They're now experiencing them more than one at a time, and they're back to back and compounding. So that's the big change in, I would say, the environment that we're seeing in populations is these compounding events, but we haven't studied how that is changing the system.
Yeah. I mean, certainly I'm in the Northern Rivers, and since 2017, I think we've had 2 1-in-100-year floods, 1 1-in-500-year floods, you know, worst bushfires that have seen heritage rainforests burn that have never burnt before, you know. And certainly, yeah, anecdotally in my clinical work, I've definitely noticed like a mood shift, I suppose. That is why I'm here, I suppose. But yeah, that compounding impact, or I think I saw it referred to in some article the other day as climate whiplash or something like that. Kind of bouncing back and forward between the two extremes, which has certainly been the case in our area. So I guess that kind of moves nicely into my next question, because I kind of wanted to shift from those more direct impacts, so the heat and extreme weather events, more into that kind of chronic or indirect effects of climate change on mental health. So as I said in my intro, what I'm quite interested in is our emotional responses to changes in our local or otherwise cherished environments. And so at the moment, there is just a huge number of terms that are used for these types of emotional responses. So I used ecological distress. There's also like eco emotions or earth emotions. And then we've got more specific terms like eco anxiety or ecological grief and solastalgia. So there still seems to be like not quite any consensus about whether those terms are necessarily referring to specific or discrete emotional experiences, or whether they're just kind of different terms to describe a more broad kind of emotional response. And then there's also, I guess, another element of not controversy, but disagreement, I suppose, about whether they should just be seen as completely appropriate emotional responses to the crisis that we're in, or whether they whether they are psychopathology in themselves, or whether there's kind of like an edge that you go over where you go from kind of an appropriate response to where it becomes quite disabling. So I just wanted to know whether you have any thoughts or deeper understandings from your research around those emotional responses and how you think they might relate to those mental health impacts of climate change.
Yeah, it's a good question, because it does feel like a bit of a minefield with all the terms that are around. But look, I think probably, and I'm guilty of this as well, it does get a little bit easy to get caught up in the terminology. But I think when you strip it all away, they're really just descriptive terms that people use. So ecological grief, I think it's probably, I don't know the origins of where that came from, but it's probably been around for decades in relation to, I mean, it makes sense for me. when I see ecological destruction, you feel grief. So it's a description of, you know, an emotion attached to a particular event or yeah.
Or loss.
Yeah, a loss. And I think, you know, those different terms that you mentioned are largely just that. So, you know, climate distress is one. The climate specific ones are probably a bit newer as we've sort of woken up to what's happening with climate change. And climate distress, though, is actually another one. It's, you know, I'm distressed because of the climate changing. So I quite like that there's all these different terms, actually, because they're quite nuanced. And I think that's just a beautiful thing about language, is that we are able to describe articulately all of these different emotions, you know, and what they're related to. So at the end of the day, they're just a description of emotions. But the question you're asking about, what does that mean? What's the interplay between that, you know, perfectly normal and appropriate response to something tragic, and mental health? Well, in the context of climate change, I would say the evidence isn't quite there, but it's definitely an area of exploration at the moment. I know that lots of people are interested in this. But if you look at what we know about emotions and, you know, clinical mental disorder or clinically significant mental health where someone needs an intervention, I would just describe it in the same way that, you know, intense emotions that lead to someone they're perfectly normal. But if they are so chronic and so intense where someone becomes overwhelmed and starts to display clinical symptoms of a mental disorder, which is completely possible, then that's the relationship and that's sort of the spectrum. I think it's important not to pathologise emotions. In fact, even climate anxiety, which, you know, the word anxiety, which is a clinical disorder, climate anxiety on its own doesn't necessarily mean someone needs an intervention, and there's some emerging research around this. It can actually be, depending on the person, it can actually be a really positive and energising and motivating response. It's when it becomes sort of maladaptive, the person becomes overwhelmed and it impacts their functioning in a negative way. That's when we sort of look at that group of people and go, okay, you might need some help here and support. So I think that's the distinction, which is not, it's a bit of a grey area, I guess, is what I'm saying, a bit of a spectrum. Yeah.
Excellent. So I guess that's kind of where I'm hoping to head with my research. So hopefully I can have some answers to that.
The other thing I'll just say on that actually is it's not quite published yet, but it's from a PhD student of mine, and she's it will be published very soon. She looked at this and in youth, not in adults, but we might find that it's a very similar story, or we can adapt her work to the adult population. But she has looked at this and, you know, what's climate anxiety and when, you know, is it something that we really need to intervene in? And where she's arrived at is that there's, you know, you can kind of, it is a spectrum, but you can look at it as a way of, is this person, if you take a group of people who are experiencing climate anxiety, we probably all are, who are the people who this is going to be, they're going to adapt. It's actually going to motivate them to make changes in their life or you know, pushes them into action, versus what is it about the people who have a maladaptive response? It paralyses them, they become overwhelmed, stressed, and it could lead to a clinical mental disorder. So she's been more interested in actually her question changed from, what is climate anxiety? Should we be worried about it? To more, what is it about youth? What are the characteristics and the factors that we can kind of determine which way they're going to go? So that might be another way, more useful way to be thinking about it, going, okay, most people are experiencing some level of climate anxiety. It's in our face, it's in our communities, and it's a collective experience. So everybody's all in here. What is it about people that's going to help them adapt and become resilient versus those people who are going to fall the other way?
Yeah. Sorry. So I guess, if we go from that into kind of looking at what can we do for those people who are struggling, I suppose. I guess something I'm getting stuck at in terms of where I should be going with this is that I guess it feels to me like, as mental health clinicians or researchers who are working in this climate change field, we're kind of stuck in a double bind at the moment, in that we know there are people who are suffering from these strong negative emotional responses, whatever we want to call them. And we need to be able to help those people and allow them to be functioning, contributing members of society and live a rich and meaningful life. But our existing models of psychological care largely place responsibility on the individual for their emotional regulation. And in the case of cognitive therapy, which is usually our first line of treatment, our interventions are usually focused on helping that person recognise maybe the irrational or unhelpful thought processes they're having, and try and shift those to something more realistic or helpful. But in climate change, we have this very real, very existential threat. But it's also a systemic issue which is intensifying inequalities and vulnerabilities in so many ways. So how do we, or where should we be heading kind of as mental health clinicians and researchers, so that we can ethically help these people who are struggling without further reinforcing that kind of problematic narrative that the responsibility falls on the individual?
Yeah, it's such a good question, such a good point you've made, Kate. And I really think that you've touched on the fundamental difference, like I said, between the way that we have been addressing mental health as, someone who presents with severe depression, for example, and the new context that we've got, where we're starting to really be impacted and realise the way that our mental health is, and our whole body health, it's not just mental health as well, it's so intimately tied to our environment. And so I've got a bit to say. And the other thing that you pointed out, that climate change is not an individual experience. If you've been affected by a flood, it's the whole of the northern rivers that's impacted. Whether your house went under or not, you were impacted, you were traumatised, you were without food, you were cut off, you were not able to access social and health services because those staff were impacted. Those houses were, like the flow-on effects across the whole community are just undeniable. So this is not about one person being traumatised by a really unfortunate and tragic event such as a car crash. This is a whole community issue. And I really believe, even though the evidence is not there yet, because we haven't, we're only just starting to change the way we think, I really believe that the solutions here are going to be collective solutions. Of course, there will be people who still need their clinical services and inpatient care, etc. But our mental health services are so overwhelmed that looking to that as a solution, as a realistic way of dealing with this, is just not feasible. And it's probably, for most people, not the most effective way to provide psychological support. So I don't know what that looks like in terms of programs. That's where the research needs to take us, I think. But I really do believe that this is a collective experience, and should the solutions lie in a community, population approach. Just remind me what else I'm meant to be talking about, because there was a lot in your question, and I remember my mind taking over.
I guess, I mean, you've pretty much kind of addressed that and my next question anyway, but yeah, I was just asking about how we ethically help people who do come in for help without reinforcing that individual responsibility story that we, that has been the bedrock of mental health care, really. Like you said, it's a person who presents with this issue, and we see this is the history of the problem, and then we need to give them the skills to fix it. But
that's right. And it's in this context, it's putting the problem at the feet of one person, and therefore putting a solution at the feet of one person.
Yeah.
And if we go back to what I just quickly say something, and then if we, because I'll forget otherwise. If we go back to what I was talking about before, how my research has started looking at this in a systems approach, it's because climate change is, this ethereal thing which is causing a lot of changes, and because it's kind of something that lies out system, it drives changes within the entire system. It's not like, I don't know, it's not just one thing. It's not, forever we've talked about the socioeconomic determinants of mental health. So poverty, housing, job, all of those things being individual factors that impact mental health, and that is 100% correct. But what do you do when a whole system is being impacted by climate change? So all of those factors, plus now we're realising we should be thinking about environmental factors of the determinants of mental health as well. What do you do when you've got this big monster thing that is driving further inequities across all of the system, across all of those factors? So not only is, if we use the example of flooding impacting a whole population because they experienced the flood, it's also that those indirect impacts which are further driving those inequities across all of those mental health determinants of mental health. Yeah. So it really is not just an individual problem. This is a whole system problem.
You briefly mentioned, like early on, I think it was maybe in the first answer to the first question, was that co-benefits of, I guess, climate action, I suppose. Have you got any examples of that has worked so far, or that is in practice already, or anything like that?
Yeah, look, a lot of it comes back. It is something that we've looked at, haven't researched yet, but there has been some research that's looked at co-benefits of or the co-benefits of climate activism. And again, I think it falls down to what kind of person becomes an activist. Yeah. But in terms of those people who take on activism, there has been some really good positive associations with, protective of mental health. So there's been a few studies that have looked at that, which is interesting. But again, I think it comes down to people who go into activism. It's like a form of tackling this head on. There's also that maladaptive group that I was talking about before, who are experiencing climate anxiety and they're overwhelmed. They're not the ones who are going out to do climate activism. Their response is, so I think it's kind of a little bit of a bias sample, but the literature definitely shows that there are co-benefits of climate activism for mental health.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we've kind of answered my last question, but I did just want to kind of, which was about kind of what your future visions are for kind of how the mental health service should look like. And I guess we've kind of answered that in that we don't really know yet, but we know it needs to be different. And very much a systemic approach. But there was, I guess, there was an article I read of yours, or that you co-authored recently, that I read, that was all about how expecting recovery is problematic in the context of mental health impacts of climate change. And again, that's I think we've kind of answered it, but I just wondered if you had any other terminology or ways of conceptualizing solutions, I suppose, if we're not aiming for recovery, what should we be aiming for?
What are we looking for? So that paper was a little bit it was just a discussion piece, but what it was trying to say was because Australia we've always been a country of natural disasters, right? So we've had bushfires and drought and cyclones up north forever and a day. And we're generally pretty good at responding to them, but it's different now. These aren't unexpected events, and they're not sort of, one every 50 years. They're happening, like where you are, Kate, in the Northern Rivers. They're happening on a rolling basis, and you'll get more than one type of event. So the old disaster, I think the disaster recovery cycle is kind of obsolete. Like, where's the end point when you've got another disaster? You're in a perpetual cycle. There is no realistic recovery in that old way that we used to think. It's not to say that someone won't recover. We don't mean to say that whatsoever. It's not a sort of doom and gloom, not meant to be a doom and gloom idea. It's an idea that we need to possibly think about this in a little bit of a different way. So how do we not just prepare communities for these events, but how do we, and communities are already good at this, so how do we provide essentially an enabling environment for communities to do what they do best, and that is to, they know what needs to be done. So how do we create this enabling environment for communities to become more resilient? Now, there's, a little bit of that term resilient is a little bit unfavourable as well, and I understand why, but we haven't sort of come up with anything else yet. It's not saying that communities aren't resilient. They are incredibly resilient, but how do we create that enabling environment for them to be fully prepared to have, psychologically, to maintain wellness, physical wellness, to, just create the right environment where they can cope with these new landscape that we're seeing due to climate change. Because at the moment it's a very reactionary response. It's post-disaster recovery funding. That's where the lion's share of funding for community. It's not until something has happened, and that has probably, that the money flows and that the support flows, and it's probably not even ever being done well when you think about mental health, because mental health presentations typically aren't in that short, immediate to medium term time frame. They're generally further down the track, and there's a lot of reasons for that, but I won't go into. But yeah, it's not like rebuilding a road. It's not like rebuilding a home or, infrastructure. It's not like getting the electricity grid back online. This is mental health, and that disaster cycle has probably never really been a good fit for mental health, but now that we're not actually getting to the end of that cycle, it's even more relevant that, pertinent is probably a better word, that we start thinking about how we transform the way we do things.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, what we've seen around here too is just that the responses are changing so much too. So, I was working after the 2017 floods in Lismore, and everyone just had this band together and build back attitude kind of thing, and everyone was, we'll bounce back and it's fine. And then those 2022 floods, because we not only had the first flood, there was another one a month later. And it's been and still, what are we, 2 and a bit years later now, that the mood just shifted completely. It was like this, oh my goodness, this is the new normal.
Yes.
And the general anxiety through the community about wet weather now is just phenomenal. And in terms of when we talk about the disaster recovery cycle, for the majority of those flood affected people in Lismore, they have not completed that cycle yet at 2.5 years either. The funding hasn't come through, or they still have uncertainty about housing, and just on the most basic needs. So yeah, it's scary and a bit of a minefield at the moment, I suppose. But yeah, hopefully this, to me, listening to you talk about that kind of systemic approach, transdisciplinary approach to the research is really exciting, because it seems like, such a broad issue, we have to really be taking that broad approach. So
yeah, so it's definitely going to take a lot of clever brains to work together from not just one area.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's the end of my questions that I had. So thank you so much. You've given me a lot to think about, and I'll definitely rewatch this and use it to inform where I'm heading with my project. But I'll just maybe hand back to Jasleen and see if she has questions from anyone else or anything like that.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Fiona. This was such an interesting conversation on how climate change is impacting all of us. But in research, in practical way, we're still looking at it as an individual problem. And the common theme which was coming out from this conversation was that it's actually not an individual experience. It's a collective experience. It's a systematic experience. The climate anxiety we are all facing is, again, not an individual thing. People who have experienced, as Kate gave an example of Lismore floods, it's the whole people, it's a group of people which experience those floods. They are all facing climate anxiety. And I think Liz can add to this. This is the conversation we had when we were developing themes for our Manna Institute. And we're like, oh, where do we put the impact of climate change? Does it need to go as a separate theme? Does it need to be an overarching concept, which is going to be covering all of the themes we are working within the Manna Institute? And through several discussions, it was identified that, the environment change, the climate change is impacting all of the different streams we're working in within the Manna Institute. It's not a separate stream. Each and every stream we're working on is going to be impacted in its own way when there's a climate change, when there's environmental change. So thank you so much to both of you for having this wonderful conversation and bringing it to us and telling us what actually is happening and what's the impact of the climate change on mental health. And before we stop recording and go to the questions, I just want to make an announcement that we have our next webinar on 20th of May. So I would love for all of you to join us. And the topic we'll be having the conversation again on is workforce in the rural, remote and regional Australia. All right, let's start the